is the fighting spirit of the Maroons. If you watched my previous video on Accompong, you know it sparked a lot of discussion. Some of you said it felt biased, and others said it focused too heavily on the sovereignty and modern conflict and didn't fully explain what the treaty actually required or the consequences that followed. There were merits to those sentiments. That first video told a story from Accompong's lived memory, how the treaty is remembered, defended, and felt today, especially after Hurricane Melissa. It showed why military presence touches a nerve that runs centuries deep. History is not contained within a single facet. So this video exists to do what the first one didn't. To slow down, go back to 1738 and lay the treaty out in full. Not just what was protected, but what it demanded. Not just what was saved, but what it cost. If you haven't watched the Accompong video as yet, I recommend you pause right here and watch that one first. I've linked it above, right up here. Now, let's dive right in. The British Empire conquered India. They colonized America. They ruled the waves. But in the hills of Jamaica, they got humiliated. For 80 years, the most powerful military on earth tried to crush a group of escaped Africans known as the Maroons. They sent redcoats, they sent trackers, they sent millions. And they died. The Maroons turned the cockpit country into a graveyard for the British Army, using the limestone hills as a fortress the English couldn't crack. So, in 1738, the empire did the only thing it had left to do. They surrendered. They signed a treaty that gave the Maroons land and total freedom 100 years before Emancipation. But to get that freedom, the Maroons had to sign a deal that some people today call a victory, and others call it a betrayal. What was in the fine print? That's the part of the story nobody talks about. When the English captured Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655, the island was already full of people who refused to live as slaves. Some had escaped from Spanish plantations decades earlier. Others ran away as soon as the English invasion created chaos. These early runaways formed the first Maroon communities in the interior. By the late 1600s, early 1700s, two main Maroon groupings had emerged. The Leeward Maroons in the west, led eventually by Cudjoe, based around Trelawney and Accompong, and the Windward Maroons in the east, led by figures like Queen Nanny and Quaco in the Blue Mountains and Portland region. At the same time, Jamaica was becoming one of the Britain's most profitable colonies. Sugar plantations exploded across the island, and tens of thousands of Africans were being shipped in under brutal conditions. The economy of the island depended on enslaved labor. Now put that together. A wealthy island built on slavery, a growing nation of runaways in the hills. That was a ticking time bomb. The Cockpit country is a massive landstone region in the central and western Jamaica, full of steep hills, sinkholes, caves, and deep valleys, almost like thousands of giant green egg cartons stacked together. The sides of these hills were so steep that even today, walking them is exhausting. So in the 1700s, in wool uniforms under tropical sun, it was a nightmare. This is where the Maroons, descendants of Africans who escaped slavery, along with some indigenous Taino survivors, built their strongholds. They knew every cave, every ravine, every hidden path. The British did not. By the 1720s and the 1730s, this turned into what we now call the First Maroon War. British troops and the local militias tried again and again to penetrate the interior to crush the Maroons. But the Maroons fought using guerrilla tactics, attacking columns on narrow trails, then melting into the bush before the British could fire proper volleys. They also used the forest to hide, sometimes described as covering themselves in vegetation, moving silently along the ridges and then vanishing into the caves. They even used the bang horn. Scouts on far hills could blow coded signals, warning villages of British advances, or calling warriors to specific locations. The British, they tried everything. Burning settlements, recruiting indigenous and African trackers, even offering bounties for maroon heads. But every time they thought they've cornered the Maroons, the Cockpit country swallowed their troops. The results were devastating for them. They lost men not only to maroon bullets and machetes, but also to malaria, yellow fever, and exhaustion. British officers wrote back to London, complaining that the war was draining money and soldiers, and they were getting very little result. While plantation owners were panicking about constant raids and the fear that other enslaved people would run away and join the Maroons. But here's the thing. Even though the Maroons kept winning the fights, they were still in danger of losing the war in the long term. They were a small population compared to the entire colony. They had limited access to gunpowder and ammunition. Everything had to be captured or traded secretly. They couldn't plant big permanent farms. If the British found them, they would just burn everything down. So while the British were bleeding money and soldiers, the Maroons were burning energy and resources. Cudjoe had to ask himself a brutal question. If we keep fighting like this for another 10 or 20 years, will we still exist? That's the pressure cooker that pushed both sides towards negotiating. By the mid-1730s, London was tired of reading reports about Jamaica being nearly ruined by a small group of fugitives. Local planters were begging the governor to solve the maroon problem once and for all. That solution turned out to be negotiation. On March 1, 1738, at a place remembered as Guthrie's Defile, a narrow pass in St. Elizabeth, near what is now Accompong Town, one of the key Maroon settlements in Captain Country. The two sides met to finalize what would become the Articles of Pacification with the Maroons of Trelawney Town, also known as Treaty of 1738 and 39, because there were multiple related treaties with different Maroon towns. Under Governor Edward Trelawney, the British opened talks with Cudjoe, a militia officer who had dealt with Maroons before, often named as Colonel John Guthrie, or other intermediaries, acted as a go-between. Here is what it actually gave the Maroons. The treaty gave Cudjoe's Maroons freedom almost a century before slavery was abolished in the British Empire in the 1830s. They were forever hereafter recognized as free, not as property, not as fugitives. This meant they were no longer considered runaways or criminals in the eyes of the British. They could not be captured or resold back into slavery. At least, not those specifically covered by the treaty. The treaty also granted about 1,500 acres in the Trelawney-Accompong area, with later surveys and expansions increasing that land over time. They were strategically chosen land between Trelawney Town and Accompong, giving the Maroons defensible territory they already used and knew well. Over time, other grants and adjustments were made, but this was the foundation of Maroon land rights. And it's why Accompong still refers back to the treaty today. The treaty didn't just recognize the Maroons as free people. It recognized their right to rule themselves. Cudjoe was formally acknowledged as the chief or captain with the power to choose successors, usually from his own family line. Inside the borders, Maroon law and leadership took priority. They settled disputes, enforced discipline, and governed daily life according to their own customs, not the planter class or the colonial magistrates. This is the same self-governance and leadership structure we talked about in the Accompong video. Colonels, council, Maroon law. Only here, you're seeing where it actually began. The British agreed to supply the Maroons with gunpowder, lead, and other necessities, and to treat them as allies in the case of foreign invasion. In return, the Maroons would help defend the colony if, say, the Spanish or French tried to capture Jamaica again. They also allowed the Maroons to trade legally with nearby plantations, buying tools, salt, cloth, and other goods. This turned the Maroons from outlaws into an official recognized community with economic ties to the colonial system. Here's the part of the story where the straightforward victory reveals its bittersweet core. After the treaties were signed in 1738-39, the relationship between the Maroons and the British changed in a very uncomfortable way. On paper, Cudjoe's people were now allies of the crown. In practice, that meant the colonial government treated the Treaty Maroons like a special forces unit. Whenever there were reports of new runaway communities forming in the hills, the authorities often called on the Maroons to track them, fight them, and bring them back. The treaty itself spelled this out. If any enslaved person ran away and fell into Cudjoe's hands, they had to return to the nearest magistrate, and the Maroons would receive a reward fixed by the assembly. Over the 18th century, Maroon warriors helped hunt down some of the most famous runaways in Jamaican history. Figures like Accompong, Three-Finger Jack, and Dagger. Men who had built their own mini Maroon bands in the interior and the raided plantations. So even while unofficial Maroon communities kept forming in the bush, the Treaty Maroons were now officially on the side of the colonial state, being paid to do the kind of manhunting that had once been used against them. They were also called in to help to put down rebellions. If there were talk of any uprising on an estate, Maroon detachments could be sent in with local militias to track leaders, terrorize rebel networks, and restore order in the eyes of the planters. That's where the moral tension really sits. The same tactics that once made the British fear the Maroons were now being rented out to protect the plantation system. Fast forward to about 50 years after Cudjoe's treaty. By 1795, the Maroons of Trelawney Town were frustrated. They felt that the British were slowly chipping away at the rights they believed the treaty guaranteed, especially around land boundaries and how Maroons could be punished. The spark that finally lit the fire is one of the most ironic and humiliating episodes in Jamaican history. Two Trelawney Town Maroons were accused of stealing pigs from a nearby estate. They were brought before a court in Montego Bay, found guilty, and sentenced to flogging. On its own, flogging was already an insult. As treaty allies, the Maroons believed they had the right to discipline their own people internally, not be whipped like ordinary slaves in a public court. But the real humiliation was how it was done. The person chosen to flog them wasn't a white overseer or a soldier. It was an enslaved man, a non-Maroon black runaway who had previously fled into the hills been captured by the Maroons under the treaty and turned over to the authorities for a fee. So basically, a man who once fought for his own freedom runs to the hills. The Treaty Maroons, acting under their agreement with the British, captured him and handed him in. Later, that same man is ordered to whip the very Maroons who helped deliver him, while other imprisoned slaves looked on and jeered. It was more than punishment. It was a public shaming for the people of Trelawney Town, who had spent decades seeing themselves as elite warriors, landholders, and treaty partners of the crown. This felt like a direct violation of their status and of the spirit of Cudjoe's agreement. Maroon leaders complained about mistreatment and violations of the treaty. When a delegation of 6 Maroon leaders, led by Montague James, went to discuss their grievances, the governor had them seized and imprisoned instead of negotiating. That betrayal, layered on top of the flogging incident, turned a local dispute about pigs into a full-blown Second Maroon War, a brutal guerrilla conflict in 1795 to 96 that devastated plantations, cost hundreds of British lives, and ended with most of Trelawney Town exiled to Nova Scotia and then Sierra Leone. So why would Cudjoe ever sign something like this? To answer that question, you have to look at it from the realities of 1738 and not the realities of today. Cudjoe did not command an army big enough to free the entire island. Jamaica at the time had tens of thousands of enslaved Africans and a powerful plantation economy deeply tied to the British wealth. His first responsibility was to the few hundred Maroons under his leadership, the people whose faces he knew, whose children ran through those hills. From that perspective, the treaty was about survival and not global justice. Before the treaty, Maroons were technically criminals, and after the treaty, they became a recognized community, almost like a small independent state within Jamaica with a defined territory. So the Maroons made a painful trade: freedom and stability for their own community, in exchange for helping hold a system that oppressed people just like them. But was it betrayal? What do you think? Drop your comments in the comment section. Let me hear your thoughts. For many enslaved Africans outside those Maroon towns, it probably did feel like betrayal. If you escaped and managed to reach the hills, you might not find liberty. You might find Maroons bound by treaty to send you back. But if the Maroons had refused these terms, there's a very real chance the British would have doubled down, expanded the war, and eventually crushed them with the reinforcements from other colonies. That's the cruel reality of colonial power. Sometimes there are no clean choices, only hard ones. That's why the Maroon Treaty is remembered as both a victory because it forced the British to recognize black freedom on Jamaican soil, and a compromise because that freedom came tied to a promise to help keep others in chains. Almost 3 centuries later, you can still see the impact of that treaty on the map of Jamaica. Accompong Town in St. Elizabeth remains a Maroon community that traces its land rights back to those original agreements. Maroons still have their own colonel, chief, their own celebrations like the big January 6th festival marking both Cudjoe's birthday in Maroon tradition and the signing of the treaty. Cockpit country is still seen as a symbol of resistance and survival, now also at the center of environmental battles to protect its forests and water resources. But the emotional legacy is complicated. On one hand, the Maroons are celebrated as freedom fighters, people who refused to accept slavery and forced the British to negotiate, not just with guns, but with the landscape itself. Their story has inspired black resistance movements all over the world. On the other hand, the clauses forcing them to return runaways and help suppress revolts created lasting suspicion. Some Jamaicans see the treaty as a deal that protected a small group while leaving the majority in chains. The truth lies somewhere in the tension between those two views. That's the uncomfortable reality of the Maroon Treaty. It's both a story of black victory and black compromise, resistance and restraint, freedom and responsibility. So when we look at that treaty today, we have to look at it with both eyes open. One eye sees the victory, a black nation that forced the British Empire to its knees and secured their land when everyone else was in chains. The other eye sees the cost, the gate that had to be closed to protect the family inside. This isn't just history, family. This is a complexity of survival. Now, I want to hear from you. If you were in Captain Cudjoe's shoes in 1738, looking at your children, looking at the British Army, and looking at that contract, would you sign it? Tell me yes or no in the comments and explain why. I'll be reading the best arguments. And listen, if this video taught you something you didn't learn in school, do me a favor. Share this video with someone who needs to know that our history didn't start with slavery. It started with resistance. For my real warriors who watched all the way to the end, drop a drum emoji in the comment section. Let them know that the heartbeat of history is still loud. Walk good, Jamaica, and stay safe. See you next time.